Stop right here and imagine this. In the 1970s, a person earning minimum wage in the United States could still have a real chance to buy a home, raise a family, and feel secure about the future. Today, even with technological advancements and supposedly more opportunities, millions struggle just to pay rent, groceries, and bills. This isn't just a feeling, it's a reality proven by decades of economic data. Why comparing then and now matters? When we talk about cost of living and quality of life, context is everything. Nominal numbers, like wages or prices, don't tell us much unless we understand how much those dollars were actually worth. That's why we need to look at things through the lens of inflation and purchasing power. Inflation over time. Between the late 1960s and the early 1980s, the U.S. experienced a period known as the Great Inflation. Inflation rates spiked as high as 8 to 12% per year before stabilizing in the 1980s and beyond. For example, annual inflation in the U.S. hit around 5.6% in 1970, followed by similar or higher rates throughout the decade. This means that the average prices of goods and services were increasing rapidly, but wages and household income tended to keep pace in ways that made life manageable for most families. Over the following decades, inflation rates oscillated, but the economy found periods of relative stability in the 1990s and early 2000s, then renewed pressure in the 2020s. Minimum wage, nominal versus real value. In 1970, the federal minimum wage was $1.60 per hour. On the surface, that number seems tiny compared to today's $7.25 federal minimum wage, which has not changed since 2009. The key point is that the minimum wage in the 1970s had much greater real purchasing power. If adjusted for inflation, those early minimum wage figures would translate to significantly higher values today. Some analyses estimate that the equivalent purchasing power of a 1970 minimum wage could be around $12 to $13 per hour in today's dollars, nearly double the current actual federal rate. Even though many states now set higher local minimum wages, the federal rate has stagnated, and overall wage growth has struggled to keep pace with rising costs of housing, healthcare, childcare, and education. Housing, the sharpest divide. One of the biggest differences between the 1970s and today is in home affordability. In 1970, the median price of a U.S. home was roughly $23,600 to $26,600. Adjusted for inflation, that might be equivalent to around $195,000 to $210,000 in 2025 dollars. Yet today, the median U.S. home price is over $410,000. That means the rate of increase in home prices has far outpaced general inflation and wage growth. To put it in perspective, if a minimum wage worker in 1970 worked a certain number of hours to afford a home, that number of hours today, even for median wage earners, would be many times greater. Some calculations show that today's home buying power for minimum wage earners is several times weaker than in 1970. Housing, the sharpest divide. One of the biggest differences between the 1970s and today is in home affordability. In 1970, the median price of a U.S. home was roughly $23,600 to $26,600. Adjusted for inflation, that might be equivalent to around $195,000 to $210,000 in 2025 dollars. Yet today, the median U.S. home price is over $410,000. That means the rate of increase in home prices has far outpaced general inflation and wage growth. To put it in perspective, if a minimum wage worker in 1970 worked a certain number of hours to afford a home, that number of hours today, even for median wage earners, would be many times greater. Some calculations show that today's home buying power for minimum wage earners is several times weaker than in 1970. Starter homes, gone or out of reach. Even so-called starter homes, smaller, more affordable houses that once served as entry points into homeownership, have become expensive or rare in many markets. In some U.S. cities, starter homes now cost $1 million or more, a dramatic increase compared with even a few years ago. Mortgage requirements have also shifted. Today's first-time homebuyers often need nearly 20% down payment, tens of thousands of dollars, just to qualify for a loan, which was far less common decades ago. The average age of first-time homebuyers has also climbed, reaching around 40 years old in 2025, compared to much younger ages in prior generations. This reflects how long it now takes to save for a down payment while paying rent and other expenses. Everyday life costs compared. Let's look at specific examples of how prices have changed over time. Food and essentials. In the 1970s, a dozen eggs cost about 61 cents. Today, the price is around $4.95 per dozen, sometimes higher. A half-gallon of milk cost around 78 cents in 1975. Today, an entire gallon costs about $4.03. While inflation gradually increases prices across decades, some cost increases are dramatic when compared to wages. For example, one report noted egg prices quadrupled over the last 2 decades while the federal minimum wage remained stagnant. Transportation and vehicles. In 1970 a new car cost about $3,700, and gasoline was 35 cents per gallon. Today, new cars commonly start above $30,000, and gasoline, while variable, often exceeds $3 per gallon. Education, healthcare, and other costs. While historic data on education and healthcare weren't part of your original text, trends show costs in these categories have grown even faster than wages and inflation, contributing to narrower financial margins for households today. For example, college tuition and healthcare expenses have grown far faster than broader price indexes, meaning that even as wages have increased in nominal terms, the share of income needed for these services has grown sharply. This trend is documented elsewhere, though detailed annual data are beyond the scope here. Jobs, productivity, and economic shifts. In the 1970s, many workers, even those without college degrees, had access to good jobs in manufacturing, industrial sectors and unionized fields that provided stable income, benefits and pensions. Over time, the economy shifted toward service sectors, tech industries, and gig work, sectors that often offer less stability and fewer benefits. Wage growth has not kept pace with increases in productivity over time, meaning workers today produce more value but do not always see proportional income gains. Some estimates suggest productivity grew far more than wages between 1979 and recent years. Real-life impact, today versus the 1970s. When economists talk about affordability, they often look at ratios between prices and wages, not just raw prices. In the early 1970s, an average home cost roughly 2.5 to 3 times the annual income of a typical household. Today, that ratio can be 5 to 6 times or more, depending on the region. Workers today often need multiple incomes just to qualify for a mortgage or pay for rent, healthcare and education, a stark contrast to a time when a single income could sustain a family. Conclusion, a revealing comparison. So what does all this data show? Money had more real value in the 1970s. Wages and prices were more balanced, and basic living costs consumed a smaller share of income. Homeownership was more attainable. A typical worker could realistically buy a home with fewer hours of labor than today. Inflation, especially in housing and essentials, outpaced wage growth. Even though the economy is more productive, wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living. Jobs and benefits were more secure for typical workers. Stable employment with benefits was more common, whereas today many workers are in precarious or gig-based jobs. Looking at the US then and now reveals a striking truth: despite nominal wage increases, the cost of living and economic pressures have grown faster, leaving many Americans worse off in terms of real purchasing power and financial security than their parents or grandparents were in the 1970s. A provocation: if life was easier then, why is it harder now? Here's the uncomfortable question no one likes to ask out loud. If the United States is richer, more productive, more technological, and more advanced than it was in the 1970s, why does life feel harder for the average taxpayer today? This isn't accidental. And it isn't temporary. In the 1970s, economic growth was built around broad participation. Wages rose alongside productivity. Housing was treated as shelter first, investment second. The middle class was the backbone of the economy, not a shrinking afterthought. Today, the system operates differently. The direction of the trend, better or worse. When we compare the 1970s to today, the trend becomes clear, and it's not moving in the workers' favor. Housing costs rise faster than wages. Taxes increase directly or indirectly. Essential services become more expensive. Debt replaces savings. Stability is replaced by uncertainty. This is not a short-term fluctuation. It's a long-term structural shift. In the 1970s, a crisis like inflation was treated as a threat to be controlled quickly. Governments feared social instability. Today, inflation is often framed as manageable, even when it erodes purchasing power year after year. Why? Because inflation quietly transfers wealth, from workers and savers to governments, corporations, and asset holders. How governments view the economy. Here's the harsh reality most people never hear clearly. The government does not experience the economy the same way taxpayers do. When inflation rises, governments collect more taxes in nominal terms. Debt becomes easier to repay with devalued money. Spending expands without explicit tax hikes. The burden is shifted silently to the population. In the 1970s, high inflation caused public outrage and political consequences. Today, inflation is normalized, explained away, and reframed as a necessary sacrifice. The truth is simple. The government's long-term incentive is not to make life cheaper for taxpayers, but to make revenue more reliable. And the easiest way to do that is to let the cost of living rise while wages lag behind. The taxpayer's reality, paying more, getting less. Compared to the 1970s, the modern taxpayer faces higher housing costs, higher healthcare costs, higher education costs, higher transportation costs, more complex and indirect taxation. Yet public trust, financial security, and upward mobility are lower. In the past, taxes funded visible improvements, infrastructure, affordable housing, education expansion. Today, taxpayers often feel they are paying more just to stay in place, not to move forward. What the future likely holds if the trend continues. If current trends continue, and there's little evidence they won't, the future looks less like the post-war boom and more like a permanent squeeze. Homeownership becomes a luxury, not a milestone. Renting becomes lifelong. Retirement is delayed or uncertain. Multiple jobs become normal, not exceptional. Financial stress becomes the default condition. The middle class, once the economic center of gravity, risks becoming a transitional phase rather than a stable destination. The core question everyone should ask. So here's the real provocation. If a factory worker in 1970 could buy a house, raise children, and retire with dignity, why can't a full-time worker today do the same in a richer country? Is the system broken? Or is it working exactly as designed? Final reflection. The comparison between the 1970s and today reveals something deeper than prices and wages. It reveals a shift in priorities. Then, economic growth aimed to lift the average worker. Stability mattered. Affordability was achievable. Now, growth concentrates at the top. Instability is normalized. Survival replaces progress. And unless this trajectory changes, the future will not resemble the past, it will move even further away from it. The uncomfortable truth is this. As long as governments rely on inflation, debt, and rising costs to sustain themselves, the life of the taxpayer will almost always become more expensive and more difficult over time. The question isn't whether life will get harder. The real question is, how much harder, and how many people will notice before it's too late? If this video made you think, hit like. Comment below, do you believe life was easier back then, or is the future still worth believing in? Subscribe for more real conversations about money, work, and cost of living. And share this video with someone who needs to see these numbers. Because understanding reality is the first step to changing it.